All right, Jabosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsim Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating the Shurim and Drushos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Haba Aleinu L'Tov, Aaron and Alana Weinberg. And thanks to Hashem for all of his nisim and niflaos, both in the revealed and hidden, for the miracle of Yonatan Shai Weinberg 14 years ago, for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael, for Eretz Yisrael, and the merit of the speedy arrival of Mashiach. Daniel and Batsheva Pava for dedicating the Shurim this month, the creation of the second yahrzeit of Batsheva's father, Reb Shlomo ben Aryeh Vey, on the 7th of Tammuz, child survivor of Auschwitz, and was zocha to leave over 100 descendants. Our week of learning sponsors, Binyamin Fleischman in memory of Shmuel Yudel, Ben Binyamin Yaakov Zichron Livracha, and our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Anthony Brem of Eretz Yisrael, the Ilui Nishmas Riva Chaya Bas Meir Zichron Livracha, on the occasion of our 26th yahrzeit. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos Avon Aliyah, the families in the Chama, all those who need to refuah Shavon together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, Kadosh Baruch Hu Merit Hashem bring home our hostages b'shalom and b'karov. Should allow our holy soldiers to be successful b'chol ma'aseh yedayim. Should shower our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael with Shmir Yisrael Hashgacha Pratis, and the merit Hashem should bring us geula, bracha, shalom for all of Klal Yisrael. But with that, let us, we have a lot to do today. A really great daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Yud Gimel. We are picking up at the Mishnah on the bottom of Yud Beis Amud Beis 12b. The Mishnah says as follows: Ir shiish ba'avodas kochavim. So continuing on the same theme, is if one has a city, if there is a city in which there is idolatrous practice occurring. So here, shiish ba'avodas kochavim, v'hayu b'chanuyos mu'utaros she'ena mu'utaros, and some of the stores were decorated, some of the stores weren't decorated. So what's going on over here? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Ir shiish ba'avodas kochavim, v'derech ha'ovdei kochavim li'oslem yom shuk v'yirid b'yomidam. So it was common ultimately, again, as we've seen, for the Ovdei Kochavim to have their Yom Tiv, and on their Yom Tiv they would have a Yerid, they would have a fair, which would mean that the entire marketplace could be devoted ultimately, again, or as part of the celebration of this Yom Tiv. So the Mishnah now discusses there were two types of stores. There were stores which were decorated, stores which were undecorated. What's the chilik? Rashi says, V'hayu b'chanuyos mutaros, v'siminhu lahem sha'osen chanuyos shalavodas kochavim heim litol nechas mehen. So the decorated stores, according to the way Rashi is understanding now, the decorated stores ultimately again would be paying a tax to the idolatry. So therefore, if you patronized the decorated stores, so understand that part of the proceeds of your sale would be given as a tax to the Avoda Zara. Rashi says, therefore again, says the Mishnah, the halacha is, so the Mishnah says, this has happened actually in Beis Sha'an. In other words, this was a question that came up. Nacham said, asuros, mutaros. Ultimately, again, the decorated stores are going to be asur, and the undecorated stores would be mutter. What does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Once again, Rashi says, Mu'utaros asuros, mefarish b'gmar, she'ena mutaros. Teba'osan she'en mutaros, lo shakli minayhu michsa la'avodas kochavim. V'lo matya la'avodas kochavim hana'a minayhu. Now, what I say, interestingly enough, so what's the idea over here? If the stores were undecorated, that means they weren't taxed as part of this Yom Tiv. What that would mean is that halacha l'maisa, if you bought something there, you sold something there, none of the proceeds of your sale would go towards the Avoda Zara, and therefore, again, technically it should be permitted. Now, Rashi raises the question we're all thinking, now, one second. We've already established beforehand that in general, on the Yom Tov itself, one is not allowed to transact anything with Ovdei Kochavim, right? We spoke about this already. Even to the point of the Mishnah saying 3 days beforehand. So the Gemara says, what about the idea of just transacting general business with Ovdei Kochavim on the day of their Yom Tov? So this is very interesting. Rashi says, Hani mili the zabuni lahu dilma masbin le behema va'azil umakriv le la'avodas kochavim. So Rashi understands over here that specific prohibition is in terms of selling something to the Oved Kochavim. For example, selling an animal to the Oved Kochavim, which he may then use for sacrificial purposes for his Avodah Zara. Inami, derech lokeach lios sameach va'azil umodi, aval mizban minayu davra hamiskayim shari, Distam mocher atsefu. So this is very interesting. So Rashi understands over here that what we're talking about in this case in the Mishnah Bosai is the sale of items that have like a long shelf life. So in general, when you're selling something that has a very long shelf life, there's not so much simcha that comes to the merchant as a result of that. Because there's not so much of a simcha, therefore again, he's not going to come to go ahead and give thanks to his Avoda Zara. So Rashi essentially gives two answers over here. So answer number one of Rashi is that ultimately perhaps the prohibition to transact things with Ovdei Kochavim on their Yom Tiv is ultimately to sell them something. But to purchase something from them may not be problematic. Furthermore, Rashi says, the types of goods that we're talking about in this Mishnah are goods that have a long shelf life, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, there's not real simcha that comes from the sale of that, and therefore it's permitted. So we'll say, well, we'll have to finesse this a little bit, because we saw no such distinction in the 11 blot up until this point in time, right? This entire time we're just speaking about a blanket prohibition against transacting business. But that's how Rashi, so again, two things to remember in Rashi. Number one, perhaps the prohibition to transact with them is to sell them something which they may then use for their own idolatrous practice, or to only purchase something that ultimately, again, has a short shelf life. So they're happy to move the merchandise. But other items which have a longer shelf life, there's not so much simcha involved in that, and therefore halacha l'maisa, they're not coming to go ahead and give thanks to Avoda Zara. Okay, good. Let's analyze this a bit more in the Mishnah, in the Gemara. Amar B'Shimon Lakish, says the Gemara. Amar B'Shimon Lakish, lo shalom ela mu'taros bevarid v'hadas. So this is very interesting. Now there's machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about what type of decoration signal that this store is paying a tax to the Avoda Zara. So Reish Lakish says the only problematic stores were stores decorated with roses and myrtle branches. Now, why roses and myrtle branches? Rashi says over here, Bevered v'hadas, shal takrovas avodas kochavim, v'usimun lahem shachanuyos halal shal avodas kochavim. So apparently, roses and myrtle branches were commonly used as part of Avoda Zara worship. So therefore, again, if you saw a store that was decorated with these items on the day of the Yom Tiv, that was an indication that what? This store was paying a tax to the Avoda Zara. And if the store is paying a tax to the Avoda Zara, then you can't patronize it. Okay? The Gemara says, now the interesting of the Gemara says it becomes Hanya Merecha, because also in addition to that, by the way, so in addition to patronizing the store, and the store is going to give a tax, which means again, you are effectively contributing to Avoda Zara. In addition to that, you're also benefiting from the scent. Right? And the scent, ultimately, again, these roses and these hadassim were used for Avodah Zarah purposes. Aval mu'taros beperos mutaros. But ultimately, again, if the store was just decorated with fruit, then ultimately, again, one is permitted to patronize the store. What's the reason? My time, Madamakra. Lo yidbak biyadcha mu'uma min hacherem. So Reish Lakish's logic is very interesting over here. So the pasuk says, when talking about Avodah Zarah, that you shall not go ahead, literally, lo yadbak biyadcha, no part of the Avodah Zarah should cling to your hand. So the Gemara understands over here, ne'nehu aser. It is prohibited to derive benefit from Avodah Zarah, top of Yud Gimel, aval mahane shari. Now both say this is quite interesting. So ultimately, again, so Reish Lakish understands that the prohibition over here is to derive benefit from Avodah Zarah, but to give benefit is not a problem. Right? To derive benefit is problematic, to give benefit is not a problem. Okay? So very interesting idea. That's Rabbi Yochanan. So that's Reish Lakish. So what's this? Reish Lakish is saying really, only problematic stores decorated with roses and myrtles. Otherwise, if it's just decorated with fruit, it's not a problem. What about the fact that you're still maybe contributing to Avodah Zarah? The real prohibition is to benefit from Avodah Zarah. So therefore, if I walk into a store that has the roses and the myrtles, the beautiful scent, I'm benefiting from that. But the fact that I'm going to patronize a store and maybe some of the proceeds go to Avodah Zarah, Reish Lakish indicates that is not problematic. Why? Only prohibition is to derive benefit from Avodah Zarah. To give benefit is not problematic. Rabbi Yochanan vehemently disagrees. Top of Yud Gimel, Side 13a. Rabbi Yochanan says, Afilu mu'teres beperos nami aser. Rabbi Yochanan says, not true. Even if the store itself is just decorated with fruit, it's also going to be problematic. Why? So it's very interesting. He says, Kavachomer nana aser mahana lakol shekein. Because we will say, again, if getting benefit is going to be aser, certainly giving benefit is going to be asr as well. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan holds whatever the store is decorated with, really makes no difference. If at the end of the day, in any way, I am benefiting from or giving benefit to Avoda Zara, that is going to be asr. Take a look at the top Rashi. Rashi says, Mahana l'kol shekain, v'hamahanahu shachen vonin shebesochon sochrei ma'os shel komrim hein. So first of all, Rashi points out over here that very often these shopkeepers were utilizing the money of some of the idolatrous priests. In other words, they were in partnership with the idolatrous priests. Inami, hu yohev le lebala ma'os mischora, so she'osa sham umati luana. Avashena mutaros lav de komrin. So we'll say, so therefore, there's two things happening over here. First of all, everyone is agreeing that only decorated stores were problematic, right? Everyone is agreeing with that. Why? Because the decorated stores ultimately, again, were somehow participatory in the Avoda Zara Yom Tiv. The shaila now is, what kind of decoration signals a problem? Rish Lakish, only roses and myrtles. Why? Because when you walk in there, you're benefiting from the scent. Because Rish Lakish says the problem is benefiting from Avoda Zara, giving benefit to Avoda Zara, not a problem. Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't make a difference. Whether you're giving benefit or receiving benefit is asr. So therefore, whether the store is decorated with myrtles and roses or just decorated with fruit, you can't patronize it on Yom Tiv itself. Can't patronize on Yom Tiv itself. Now, obviously, again, according to everyone, if the store is undecorated, that's indicative that what? The store is non-participatory in the Avoda Zara Yom Tiv, and therefore no problem going ahead and patronizing such an establishment. Okay, so I'll say, so let's analyze. But the point of contention, obviously, between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish is, what is the status of giving benefit to Avoda Zara? Rish Lakish says, no problem. Rabbi Yochanan says, big problem. So that's going to be our point of contention now. So Meisvei, so Gemara is Zekasha, Rabbi Nassan says, Yom Shavodas Kochavim. Manachas Bas Hamachas. So Bas is very interesting. So there was a day, sometimes the Avoda Zara, they would declare tax-free day or tax-free week, right? What would happen on tax-free day? They would make the following announcement, right? They would exempt people from taxes with the following criteria. Machrizin va'omrim. They would announce, whoever takes atara literally means like a crown, but it actually means a wreath, right? Whoever takes a wreath, like you can imagine, again, especially after we just saw that the roses and the myrtles were often used for Avodah Zara. So b'pashtos, whoever takes a wreath, right, a rose wreath and a hados wreath, and you put it on your head and the head of your donkey. So essentially, if you put on an Avoda Zara wreath, then what's talacha? You will be released, right? Show up at the register with your wreath, the wreath on your donkey, and again, you won't be charged tax. Okay? But if you don't wear the wreath, you will get charged tax. So now this is very interesting. Yehudi shenimtza sham mayase. If a Yid is there, if a Jew is there, what should he do? Why I will say it's a little bit of a catch-22. Yaniach nimtzanene. If the Jew puts on the wreath, then what? He's benefiting from Avodah Zara. Lo yaniach. If he doesn't put on the wreath, nimtza mahane. Then what? Then he's giving benefit. Right? Because at the end of the day, then he's paying taxes, and the taxes ultimately benefit the idol. So it's a shtickle catch-22, because either way, again, the Jew is either benefiting from Avodah Zara or giving benefit to the Avodah Zara. Mikan Amru, so we'll say, so from here, Chazal said, Hanose v'nosin b'shuk shel avodas kochavim, that if you do business in the shuk of idolaters, behema te'aker, if you purchase animals, the animals should be, we've seen the lashon of ti'aker. Ti'aker means the tendon in the leg should be cut. We'll define just a moment. Peros uksus v'kelim yirkavu. If you buy produce, clothing, utensils, they should be left to rot. Ma'os uklimatachos yolichem yamamelach. And ultimately, again, money or coins and silver utensils should be thrown into the Yamamelach, into the Dead Sea. As well, so it's another way of saying that really don't do business in the marketplace of Avodah Zara, of the Avodah Zara. And if you do, you really should not get benefit from it. Now, I will say, if you notice, by the way, the Gemara doesn't answer the question. Right? So what should one do in such a situation like that? So essentially what the Gemara says is, look, if you got to buy the item, but just understand you really shouldn't get benefit from it, which ultimately is a tremendous Moser Haskell in and of itself, because what are Chazal really saying? Don't put yourself in that situation to begin with. So much of success in life has to do with the avoidance of compromising situations. We put ourselves in difficult situations, in compromised situations, and then again, we're faced with very difficult decisions to make, and often we fail. And we fail not because we're weak, we fail not because we're not good, we fail not because we don't care, but we fail because we were not diligent and vigilant enough to avoid compromising situations. So much of life, like the Mishnah in Avoda says, is Ezehu Chacham, who is wise, Haroa es Hanolad. See what's coming down the pike. See what's going to unfold. Prevent yourself from ever being put into compromised situations, and one could save themselves so much spiritual heartache. The Gemara says, Ve'ezu Iker. By the way, what's Iker? Right? What is this? We just saw this in, I think, yesterday, Sunday. It's cutting the tendons of the animal's leg towards the lower part, towards the hoof. Katani mihas. Now again, bottom line, why do we call this Bryce of Rabbi Nassan? Katani mihas. Yaniach nimsa nene, lo yaniach nimsa mahana. What was the catch-22 of the Jew in this situation? If he puts on the wreath, then what? He's benefiting from Avoda Zara. And if he doesn't put on the wreath, then what? He's giving benefit to Avoda Zara. So what do you see from here? That it's not just benefiting from Avoda Zara that's problematic, but what? It's giving benefit that's problematic as well. So we'll say, so again, this is the kasha against Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish says it's only problematic to get benefit, not problematic to give benefit. So halacha l'maisa, this seems to be a kasha on Rish Lakish, to which the Gemara says, Aram Shar Shebreid Rav Idi, Kasavar Rav Shimon Lakish. Rish Lakish holds Pligi Rabbanon Alei de Rabbi Nassan, Va'anadamik Rabbanon de Pligi Alei. Okay, so Rish Lakish will simply say, the Brisa makes it sound like everyone agrees with Rabbi Nassan, but that's not true. Not everyone agrees with Rabbi Nassan. The rabbis disagree with Rabbi Nassan, and ultimately, again, I hold like the Rabbanon. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan Savar Lo Pligi. Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, holds that no, the Rabbanon do not argue on Rabbi Nassan, and therefore everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, one is not permitted to give benefit to Avoda Zara either. Okay, the Gemara says, "V'lo pligi." Is that true that they don't argue? But they do argue. V'tanya, we learned holchin liyirid she'ovdei kochavim v'lochin mehen behema avadim u'shvachos batim v'sados ukramim. I'm supposed to listen to this. This is very interesting brisa. So the brisa says you can go to the fair. You read this like a fair, like a marketplace. You go to the fair of Ovdei Kochavim, and when there, you could purchase from them animals, avodim, shvachos, right? Male servants, female servants, batim, homes, sodos, fields, krumim, vineyards, the kosef umale ba'arko shalahem. Not only that, Rabbi says it's quite fascinating. You can go ahead and make sure that you write your deeds, right? And take care of your paperwork in their courts of law. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi's in the short lines of Rashi, 4 lines in. Umala barko shalahem, makim gidulehen v'shoftehen, umala shtarosav lifneim lachtom. In other words, get your paperwork certified in their courts, right? In their courts, which I both say, why am I not doing this in Beis Din? Why not? Because the Akum doesn't care about Beis Din, right? If the Akum is going to honor the claim, ultimately, again, the documents have to be certified in his Beis Din. Now, even though, again, we'll talk about this, one is not supposed to use a Gentile court for a variety of reasons, but amongst them, because you're giving kavod to the Gentile system of law. Nevertheless, the Gemara says, the most of Avoda, and the Akum may come to go ahead and give thanks to his Avoda Zara. But if that's the case, why is he allowed to do it? Go back to the Gemara. Because it is like you're saving the property from the Akum, which Rabbi says is another way of saying, if you buy from an Akum, the only way to cement the claim is to have your claim solidified by a Gentile court, right? Without that, you run the risk ultimately of the Akum reneging on the transaction. So the Gemara goes weiter. Vimhaya Kohen. So I'll say not only that, but if a person is a Kohen, even if a person is a Kohen, halacha l'maisa, and he bought something from an Akum, even if he has to become tamei and go to chutz la'aretz, he's allowed to do so. Again, we'll define what that means in just a moment. And the same way that a Kohen is allowed to go to chutz la'aretz in order to adjudicate with an akum and ultimately solidify his transaction, so too is even allowed to go into a cemetery. The Gemara says, what? A Kohen is allowed to go into a cemetery to go ahead and deal with a financial matter? Tuma d'oraisa. I will say a Kohen is only allowed to become tamei for one reason, and that is meis mitzvah. There's an unattended corpse, or obviously, again, for a regular Kohen, for the funeral of his 7 close relatives, but not for a financial matter. So what does it mean he's allowed to go into the cemetery, ultimately, again, to go ahead and adjudicate this case? Ella beis hapras t'rabbanan. So what this means is as follows. Remember, there's 2 types of tumah that we're dealing with over here. First of all, there's tumas eretz ha'amim, which is Chazal legislated a general rabbinic tumah on chutz la'aretz. Chutz la'aretz, you leave Eretz Yisrael, you are rabbinically tamei. What's the reason for that? Because in chutz la'aretz, generally they were not as careful with the marking of graves. So because that halacha l'maisa, wherever you went, you had to be concerned potentially about the kever. In addition to that, there's also something called the beis hapras. Beis hapras means a field that we know once upon a time had a grave, but the field was plowed over. So the issue now is we don't know where the grave is, and not only that, but there may also be a bone fragment somewhere in the grave. So that ultimately, in the field, that ultimately, again, also results in rabbinic tumah. So bottom line, what the Gemara is saying over here is, if a Kohen has a case, a property case, or a monetary case against an akum, he is allowed to legislate that case, even if it will cause what? Rabbinic tumah. Because rabbinic tumah, he has to go to chutz la'aretz, he has to go to beis hapras. He's allowed to legislate. He's allowed to legislate. Ultimately, again, those cases. So the Gemara says, umetame. Furthermore, well, says incredible Gemara, umetame, lilmot Torah valisa isha. Furthermore, it's about a Kohen. A Kohen is also permitted to become tamei in order to learn Torah and to go ahead and get married. Now, what does this mean? Now, bepashtos, what this means is, let's say there's a shidduch, Kohen's in Eretz Yisrael, there's a shidduch in chutz la'aretz, or there's a yeshiva that he wants to go to, it's in chutz la'aretz. Ultimately, again, he's allowed to become tamei in order to go ahead and learn Torah and get married. I'm Rabbi Huda. So Rabbi Huda says, when is that so? When is that so? Bisman Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, second wide line. I'm Rabbi Huda me'emasai bisman shen motze lilmod. That's only if he has nowhere to learn, ultimately, again, in Eretz Yisrael. Aval bisman shen motze lilmod. But if he can find the yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, he can find the shidduch in Eretz Yisrael, eino tamei. Ultimately, again, he is not permitted to become tamei. Rabbi Yossi says, "Afilu bizman shemotzi lilmod yitma." Not true. Even if there is yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, there might be 1 or 2 yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael, right? Even if there is yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, he's still allowed to leave and become tamei in order to learn. Why? Lefi she'ein adam zocha lilmod mikol. We'll say a person is not able to learn from any rebbe. Person has to find a rebbe who speaks to them. Person has to find the yeshiva that speaks to them. So even though there might be many rebbe, might be many yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael, if I need a specific kind of person and that person is in chutz la'aretz, then I am allowed to go ahead and follow that person or go to that person in chutz la'aretz. So I'll say an incredible Gemara. If you take a look, by the way, just at Tosas, just an interesting sugya. We've actually seen this before in Ksuvas. It's Tosas Lilmot Torah Valisa Isha. It's the second Tosas in the wide lines. Tosas says Perish V'daito Lachzra Li Eretz Yisrael. Now, interestingly enough, so Tosas understands over here that when the person is leaving to get married or ultimately to learn Torah, their intention is to go, learn, get married, and come back to Eretz Yisrael. He says, "De'ilu in daito lachzar," because if a person is leaving Eretz Yisrael and their intention is not to return, Amar b'ksuvas parak beis achav shalzen nasa isha v'los chavim u'meis parchamak v'shahargu v'zeh yared achav l'chutz la'aretz v'dafka b'hanach mitzvah. Okay, so we'll say so again. Tosas calls the Gemara Maseches Ksuvas, where halacha l'maisa again, if a person leaves Eretz Yisrael without the intention to come back, that warrants the death penalty. Very, very strong Gemara. So he says, "V'dafka b'hanach mitzvah shein chashuvos lilmod Torah shegadol talmud Torah shmei v'didei ma'isa v'yishnam v'dichsev lo sobra l'shav Zara aval hashar mitzvahs." Furthermore, Tosas says the dispensation to leave Eretz Yisrael is only for these major mitzvahs of learning Torah and getting married. But for other mitzvahs, Tosas posits there is no license to leave Eretz Yisrael. V'hachi masha parakdal de Megillah, aval b'shiltos Rav Acha mefaresh hanach tekili, v'kol shekim l'shar mitzvah shem chashuvos. So I just wanted to point this out to you. An interesting machlokes in Tosas is the dispensation. So two things Tosas is saying. Number one, when there is a dispensation to leave for a mitzvah, the dispensation is to leave and come back. It's never a one-way ticket. Never one-way ticket. That's number one. Number two, fundamental machlokes, is the dispensation just for Torah and marriage, or is it for any mitzvah? Fundamental machlokes. Okay, back to the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Ma'aseh Yosef HaKohen shehalach achar Rabbo litzidon lilmod Torah. And the Gemara tells an actual story about this. One time, Yosef HaKohen actually followed his Rebbe to Tzidon, which is outside of Eretz Yisrael, in order to learn Torah. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha Rabbi Yossi, and ultimately again Rabbi Yochanan said, the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. Alma pligi. Therefore, I will say, by the way, you see from here, the point of this entire brisa, the point of this entire brisa is ultimately, again, to highlight the idea that the Rabbanan do argue on Rabbi Nassim. That was the point of this entire brisa. Well, so I'll just point out about there's a beautiful Musar Haskell in this brisa, this lashon of mitame lumo Torah valisa isha, that you're allowed to become tamei in order to learn Torah and in order to get married. So of course, Pshat is that what is the Gemara talking about over here? About leaving Eretz Yisrael. There's also tremendous Musar Haskell in this, that I will say sometimes in order to learn Torah, a person has to be mitame themselves. What does this mean? That sometimes, interestingly enough, scaling the spiritual ladder sometimes leads a person ultimately to have to be involved in things that are less than holy. What does this mean? So there's a beautiful Gemara. The Gemara says, Gadol hachnasas archim yoser mehakbalas penei ashchina. Right, so Kabbalah, right, so that literally, again, hospitality is even greater than receiving the divine countenance. Where does the Gemara learn this from? From Avram Avinu, right? Because the Pasuk says, Vayer alav Avram, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeared to Avram Avinu. He was talking to him after the Bris Milah, and then the Malachim come along, and what happens? Avram Avinu takes leave of the Ribbon Shalom and goes to do Achnasas Archim. So the Gemara says, from here you see that Achnasas Archim is even greater than Kabbalah V'Neshchen. So ask the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, what does that mean? Like practically, what does that mean? So the Rebbe says something so beautiful. He says, sometimes Achnasas Archim causes a little bit of a diminution in a person's own ruchnius. Because what happens, Rabbi Saim? Sometimes you have company at your table, and what occurs? They're talking about things that you don't really want to talk about. And they're bringing up things that you don't want to talk about. And a person can say to themselves, you know what, what do I need this for? I'd be so much better off just insulating a little bit, right? Just a little bit, kind of cocooning a little bit, keep people on the outside. I'll have my beautiful table, my Zmiras and Divrei Torah. But that's not how a Yid works. The Gemara is saying it is so much more important to be there for your fellow Jew, even if it means that your own personal ruchnius takes a little bit of a hit. Right? Sometimes a person has to sacrifice. Ultimately, again, for Kabbalah's Pnei Ashchina, sometimes what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants of us is to be able to do and to give for the other, even if my own personal growth takes a little bit of a back seat. So sometimes a person is mitame themselves, ultimately, again, for Torah. Torah is not an ivory tower. Torah is not a purist pursuit. Torah represents ruchnias, and sometimes ruchnias requires of us to sacrifice certain things, to be mitame certain parts of ourselves in order to be able to be part of the klal, in order to be part of the nation, in order to be able to give to others. Same thing in marriage. Same thing in marriage, I will say. Sometimes in life, a person has to be willing to give certain things up of themselves. Maybe it's time for myself. Maybe it's time by myself. Maybe it's doing things for myself. The same way that what happens with Tumah. Person becomes Tameh, I am sacrificing Tara. Sometimes in order to build a beautiful marriage, Lisa Isha, you have to be willing to give up and to sacrifice things that are yours and that are very important to you for the sake, ultimately, again, of the marital collective good. Torah requires sacrifice of one's personal Tara, and sometimes marriage requires a sacrifice of one's personal Tara as well. Incredible Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan says as follows, the Olam lo pligi. In reality, Rabbi Nassim and Rabbanan don't argue. V'lo kasha. This is very interesting. Kam b'lokech min hatagar the shakli michsa minei. Kam b'lokech min balabayis the lo shakli michsa minei. Oh, maybe there are two different types of transactions, right? If you're purchasing from a merchant, merchants paid taxes. So because merchants pay taxes, that's where you are giving benefit to the Avoda Zara. On the other hand, if you're purchasing from a householder, we'll say Balabais is just stam a guy, right? He doesn't have a business license. He's just selling out of his house, right? So the Maisa, that person doesn't pay taxes. That person does, and perhaps that's the situation where engaging with them, even on the Yom Tov itself, is not going to be problematic. Very interesting. So the Gemara says, good. Amar Mar, Behemati Aker. So now the Gemara is just going back to the Brisa, right? So the Brisa pointed out that ideally, avoid the situation of being in the marketplace to begin with. But if you're there and you ended up purchasing an animal from Ovei Kochavim, you have to go ahead and cut the tendon. One second, how can you do that? That's causing distress to a living animal. Amra Abai, Amra Achmana, Es Susehem Te'aker. Now, say the pasuk says, the pasuk ultimately, see again, it's very interesting. The pasuk says that Susehem Te'aker. This is Yoshua. Yoshua talking to Klal Yisrael when they conquer the Ovdei Kochavim, cut the tendons of the horses. Now, the fact that the Navi says to do it means that it's mutter. Right? In other words, they both say Tsar B'alei Chaim. Essentially, what the Gemara is saying is like this: Tsar B'alei Chaim means unnecessary pain to an animal. But if it's necessary, you're allowed to do it. Necessarily allowed to do it, right? We'll say again, this is a lot of interesting halachic literature about this, about let's say testing certain products on animals. So again, remember, it's only tzar b'alei chayim if halacha l'maisa is unnecessary. But if there is a point, right? If it serves a benefit, then it's not called tzar b'alei chayim. Amar Mar, ve'izu obviously I just simplified a much more complicated halachic discussion. But okay, Amar Mar, ve'izu ikar. What is ikar? It's cutting the tendons towards the lower part of the hoof. Or mini, the Gemara is the kasha. That's the definition of ikar. The Gemara is now challenging that definition. Or minhi, ein makdishin ve'in machrimin ve'in ma'arichin bizman hazeh. Well, this is very interesting. You are not allowed to be makdish something. Hektish. Contemporarily, in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash, you cannot make something hektish. Machrimin is a cherem vow, right, which is also a type of hektish. Ve'ei marichin, an erech vow, which is right where you pledge the erech, the value of something. Bizman hazeh. You cannot do these things today. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi machrimin kasavar stam charon lebedek habayis deplukti be'erchin v'kivan dehashta leka Beis HaMikdash Asi behudi de takala de mishani mehektish umeila. So Rabbi says, so this is very interesting. So the Gemara says over here, do not make hektish, do not make something hektish, do not do a cherem vow, and do not do an erech vow. Now, Rabbi say what's interesting to note is why Rashi says, because there's no Beis HaMikdash, and you're going to come to utilize these items, which makes it sound like, what's the status of the designation? What's the status of the designation? That it works. It works, at least in some way. So the problem is, you're being makdish something, you're making an erech vow, a cherem vow, and now you have nowhere to give it, which ultimately means, at the end of the day, you're probably going to come to misappropriate it. Therefore, don't do it. Vim hekdish, v'hechrem, v'herech. What if you did it? What if you did it? So what's the halacha? So behema te'aker. So an ema te'aker, we'll see what the definition over there is. Perus uksus v'kelim, right? Produce, clothing, utensils, we'll say amadeis, yirkavu, should be left to rot. Mos uklimatachos yonichim liyam melach. And ultimately, again, metal utensils, money, should be thrown into the Dead Sea. Ve'ezuhi ikur. What's ikur? Noel deles befanel v'meisa me'aleh. Lock the animal in a room, and essentially he just dies, starves to death and dies. So both say it's a contradiction. We said, what's ikar? We said before, what's ikar? Ikar is the splitting of the tendon by the hoof. Here we're saying ikar is putting it in a closed room and allowing it to die. So which one is it? Amar Abai is shiny hasam, mishum bizayin kachim. No, it's different over there. You can't split the tendons. Why? Because if you split the tendons, it looks like you are mistreating or degrading sacrificial animals. Kachim. I see. Therefore, therefore, what you have to do is you lock the animal away, and essentially it dies on its own. It dies on its own. Rashi says over here, Hasam Mishum Bizayon Kachim, for Rashi on the top line, the Amriti Aker, because if you're going to split the tendons, Eina Mesa Mehera, Nira Bizayon Lizman Maruba. So we'll say the problem is The animals, you'll split the tendons, but let me say the animal's not going to die from that, immediately. So instead, what's just going to end up happening is the animal wastes away over time, and that represents a degradation to kachim. So therefore, again, in this case, ti'aker means put it in a room and let it die. So the Gemara says as follows: V'nishchetei mishchat. So why don't you just kill it? Why don't you just slaughter it? To which the Gemara says, because we're concerned if you slaughter it, what may happen? What may happen? You may eat it, right? And eating it, of course, is also problematic. So just decapitate it, right? Just cut its head off. This way, again, if you decapitate it, no one's going to eat it because it didn't have a proper shechita. But like this, the animal is just dead immediately, can't be misappropriated. The pasuk says by Avoda Zara, you shall destroy the mizbeach, right? To destroy the mizbeachos. The Gemara says, lo sasu kin Hashem elokechem. The way you destroy Avoda Zara, you shouldn't chas v'shalom treat HaKadosh Baruch Hu that way. Therefore, the Gemara says to just decapitate a sacrificial animal because you're afraid it's going to be misappropriated looks like destruction, and that looks like the way you treat Avoda Zara, not the way you treat HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rava says, so also very interesting. Rava says, no, you can't decapitate it. Why? Because it looks like you are purposely inflicting a blemish on a sacrificial animal. The Gemara says, nira, right? It looks like you're inflicting a blemish. Mum ma'al yehu. That's a pretty big blemish, right? In other words, decapitation is a pretty big blemish. So I say, so it's not look like you're inflicting a mum. You are inflicting a mum. To which it's very interesting. Hani mili. So Rabbi said, this is quite interesting. When is it problematic to inflict a mum? That's when the Beis HaMikdash stands. This is very interesting. And therefore the animal is fit for offering. The Gemara says, Delo chazi lahakrava, less lanba. But if the animal is not fit for sacrificial service, it's very interesting, then there is no issue with, in other words, there's no impact of inflicting a mum. So you see here what's happening over here? That when is it problematic to inflict a mum? When the animal is fit for sacrificial service. If the animal is not fit for sacrificial service, there's no problem with inflicting a mum. If there's no Beis HaMikdash, the animal is not fit for sacrificial service. To which the Gemara says, but one second. V'lehave kimatal mum bebal mum. This is fascinating. What happens if you have a sacrificial animal that is already a bal mum? Are you allowed to inflict a further mum on that animal? So the answer is no. The answer is no. Even if an animal is already a bal mum, you can't inflict another mum on it. Ta'afagav delo chazi lahakrava aser. Ultimately, again, even if you have an animal that is already a bal mum and therefore not fit for temple use, you still can't inflict another mum on that animal. The Gemara says, but here's the difference. Bal mum nihidelo chazi legufei ledemei chazi. Here's the difference. If you have a regular bal mum animal and the Beis HaMikdash stands, as much as you can't go ahead and offer it up, it still has what? It still has financial sanctity. However, over here, lafuki hacha delo ledami chazi v'lo legufei chazi. Over here, at the end of the day, this animal, it's not fit for sacrificial use and it's not fit for financial use. In other words, you can't use it for anything. Therefore, perhaps it would not be problematic. I will say, that notion of you're not allowed to inflict a mum on a bal mum, also a tremendous Musar HaSkil, which is what? Don't compound your problems. A lot of times what ends up happening in life is we make a mistake and we figure that once already I'm in a bad spot in life, what's the big deal? I'm already a bal mum. So what does it matter if I'm a bal mum with one mum or a bal mum with two mums? It does matter. It does matter because just because I have one mum, okay, there's a blemish, but there's still a prohibition to inflict another mum upon an already bal mum. Just because I made mistakes in life doesn't mean I should double down on those mistakes. Doesn't mean I should compound those mistakes going forward, even though that mum might still be there. I both say, sometimes in life we do things and the mum is not going away. The mum is going to remain. But just because you have some blemishes in life from things that you cannot change does not mean you should inflict more personalistic spiritual damage upon yourself. Incredible. Let's go weiter. So now, interesting, I just want to point out, what you see from here, and this is kind of the takeaway from this, is there are two different definitions of ikur, right? There's general ikur. When we say ikur, what general ikur means is the splitting of the tendons in the lower part of the foot. It happens to be that by kadshim, by karbanos, when you see this lashon of ikar, so ikar might mean putting it away in a room and letting it starve to death. Okay, so just different definitions. So the Gemara goes weiter. Ashkeche Rabbi Yonah Rabbi Eloi, the kaya pischa detzur. Rabbi Yonah saw Rabbi Eloi, and Rabbi Eloi was standing at the entrance of the city of Tzur. Amrle katani behema ti'aker eved mai. Shabbos says, so the Brisa said before that you should not purchase anything from the marketplace of an Oved Kochavim. But if you did, if you purchased an animal ti'aker, what happens if you purchased an Eved? What should you do with the Eved? So Eved Yisrael kami boili. So obviously, if you purchased a Jewish servant, obviously not doing anything to that Jew. Ki kami boili Eved Oved Kochavim mai. Ultimately, what happens if you purchased an Eved that's an akum? What is there anything you have to do to him if you illegally purchased him from the akum marketplace? Amrle makami boilecha. What's your kasha? Tanya, we learned this. Oved Kochavim baroi behema daka lo ma'alin v'lo mridin. So we'll actually see this sugya. Oved Kochavim, and those who shepherd small animals. So we're going to see about the prohibition of raising small animals in Eretz Yisrael. We'll discuss that. These people who are considered to be sinners, the akum and the roi behema daka, lo ma'alin v'lo mridin. You can't push them into a pit. But if they fell into a pit, you do not have to help them out. Now again, that's going to require a lot of interpretation, right? Point over here is we see you can't actively harm an akum. That's the point. Ultimately, again, but what did we learn? We see from here that, right, the Brisa says that Allah so you could purchase from them a behema of vadim shvachas. Eved Yisrael, so what are you talking about? Is it a Jewish servant? Or perhaps it's even an Eved Oved Kochavim. Amrle mistabra Eved Yisrael. It must be talking about an Eved Yisrael, a Jewish servant. Why? Di Eved Oved Kochavim, because ultimately, again, if it's an Eved who's an akum, lemai mi boile. Ultimately, again, why? Like in other words, what would be the point of that? No, there's a maila to purchasing an Eved Oved Kochavim. Why? Because they will say when a Jew purchases an Eved, a Gentile servant, what is he doing? Essentially, that servant becomes quasi-Jewish, right? And upon emancipation, becomes fully Jewish. So maybe there is an Inyan for a Jew to purchase a Gentile servant because he's bringing him closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To which the Gemara says, Amrav Ashi atu behema my machnis tachas kanfi ashchina. But by a purchase of a behema, what kiruv is involved in that, right? In other words, how is he bringing him closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Ella mishum mi'utayhu hachanai diamati shari. In general, again, Rabbi was saying there is a benefit to purchasing items from an akum. What's the benefit? Rabbi was saying, what's the benefit? The benefit is less money for the akum, more money for the Jews. All right, it's true, right? So again, why is it beneficial? More money for the Jews? Because what that does is it diminishes the influence of the akum and amplifies the effect or amplifies the influence of the Jew. So therefore, to whatever degree a Jew can go ahead and purchase things from an akum to minimize his influence, that is certainly beneficial. So we'll stop over here for today. And I went a little bit quickly today. Thank you everyone for the few minute later start. But again, we're good. We'll pick up here tomorrow. And again, I will say, we have to figure out what we have to do tomorrow, when we finish up the sugya, we'll do the Rambam, because still how to fit this sugya where we're actually transacting business with an akum on the Yom Tov with our original sugyas, that reconciliation stuff. So I will say, Minyan this morning is going to be in the main shul. There's a bris Baruch Hashem this morning. So 6:45 Shachris will be here in the main shul. 6:50 Shachris at the Kaplan Shiva home. If you're able to make that, be much appreciated as well. Shachris again, main shul, 6:45. Shkoyach everyone. Again, I forgot to announce also weekly sponsor by Mr. Shalom Rosenblum. And I forgot to announce it because whatever, it's not. In honor of the Rebbe's yard site, the Meretz Hashem Rebbe can continue to inspire us in Meretz Hashem for many generations to come. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron, have a great day, everyone. Sorry? No. You know.